I thought today it might be fun to explore and celebrate some of the spookiest, the freakiest, the most outright terrifying cacti and succulent on Earth. We're going to be looking at plants that evoke the gothic seduction of the vampire, or the hacked together monstrous form of a Frankenstein's monster. Strange cosmic things that make us question our place in the universe. And one plant at the very end that is more terrifying than everything else combined. So let's not delay, let's have a look at these bold, terrifying, monstrous plants, shall we? Now, what better place to start a video on terrifying and freaky plants than with the mutants of the plant world? I'm talking about monstrous plants, those plants that grow with an abnormal form, different from how most of their species grow. And what better example than Mammillaria bocasana Fred. Now, because I am a man of high fashion, I've staged mine in this delightful custom skull pot to evoke the idea of cauliflower-like brains almost oozing out of the top of the head. Very, very tasteful, I'm sure you can agree. Now, this plant looks nothing like the typical growing form of Mammillaria bocasana, which is, I suppose, a small, low-growing, clumping cactus with little hooked spines and a little bit of fuzz on it. This thing instead is like a whole bunch of warts piled on top of each other. And the most freaky thing about it is that it's rubbery. It's got this real kind of squishy texture about it, which only adds to the grotesque growth form of this plant and makes it a plant that I really enjoy growing. Give it enough time and it will turn into this huge rubbery clump. I've cut a few off over the years to propagate it, and that's kept its size in check. But there's another equally hideous monstrous plant that I also think is well worth checking out. The plant in question is this thing. It looks almost like a weird red tumour. This has been grafted because the red colouring prohibits it from growing on its own roots very effectively. This plant is called Echinopsis chocolate. It's the most unappealing looking chocolate I've ever seen in my life, but it is a lot of fun to grow and it's very, very strange. Now, your Echinopsis plants, again, low growing, spiny things with often really quite beautiful flowers. As far as cacti go, they are amongst some of the most beautiful, and yet I think we can all agree that this hideous monstrosity is at the other end of the scale. That's the joy of monstrous plants though. They're a random mutation, sometimes genetic, sometimes emerging from damage on a plant, and you never quite know how they're going to grow because many monstrosities are actually quite beautiful. Take for example the blue booby cactus, Cactus geometrizans fukuroku ryuzin boku. Say that 10 times fast, I challenge you. A fantastic and very appealing plant, quite symmetrical, quite delicate, quite beautiful, quite feminine. But sometimes you get the other end of the spectrum, just these hideous, formless grotesqueries that are almost mock the nature of life itself, but fun to grow. And this plant provides us with a perfect segue into our next category, the Frankenstein's monsters. I'm talking about grafted plants, where we take two different species, hack them up surgically, connect them together, and have them continue to grow in, I suppose, an artificial semblance of life, sometimes for good purpose, like with this guy, because this thing isn't going to survive on its own roots very, very well at all. And sometimes just because we want to play God, a little bit like Dr. Frankenstein himself. Let me show you another grafted plant that is emblematic of that very fact. This plant, this is not a cactus, this is a plant called Euphorbia columnaris. And as you can see, it's been grafted. The reason for that is because these plants are notoriously difficult in cultivation. For whatever reason, they just don't seem to like to grow on their own roots. I'm not exactly sure why. Maybe one day I'll chop this thing up and see if I can coax it to grow itself. But for now, I'm taking the safe approach. And as you can see, it's been grafted onto what looks like some form of Euphorbia canariensis. And that's the thing. When you get two related plants, chop them up and fuse them together, graft them, you can get some fantastic results. But the end result, as far as appearance-wise goes, in my opinion, is pretty hideous. It's never a particularly good look. Really, it evokes that idea of your Frankenstein's monster. Something, a living thing crafted from the body parts of all different things stitched together. This thing is equally hideous. Maybe it's just the fact that there's two different forms. Now, your most common grafts that you're going to find are those moon cacti that you see in garden centres and nurseries all over the place. Those little red Gymnocalycium mihanovichii that have been grafted onto a dragon fruit stock. The colouring in them, that bright red colour, the bright yellow colour, again, that's a lack of chlorophyll. Plants need chlorophyll to grow. Without it, they die a very, very rapid death. So by being grafted, that enables them to live, at least in the short term. They often succumb to fungal issues. These grafted things, they can be a little bit finicky. I guess a little bit like Frankenstein's monster, hey? Now let's go from one gothic monster to the next. From that idea of Frankenstein's monster to perhaps that maybe outdated trope of the seductive vampiress. What I'm talking about here are night flowering cacti, like this fantastic clumped echinopsis. You can actually see it's just starting to develop flower buds right now. When it does flower, it's not going to bloom in the daytime, atypical of what we think of many flowering plants that need bees to come and pollinate them, because these things out in habitat are typically pollinated either by moths or, fantastically for our monster theme today, by bats. That's right, bats. How fantastic is that? Cacti living in harmony with bats. It is so vampiric in the classical sense. Now this is a good example of that, but there's an even better one, and the name leans right into that vampiress trope. Let me just get it for you. It's this scraggly looking thing here. Doesn't look like much, it looks more like some weird tentacled monster. But this is Solenicarius grandiflorus. It's an epiphytic cactus. The reason it looks like this is because I just found it growing under the hedge in my garden, dug it up, and here we are. But Solenicarius grandiflorus, that name grandiflorus means big flower. And the common name of this particular plant is the queen of the night, because its flowers, when they emerge in the night time, are absolutely enormous. We're talking about saucer-sized flowers. Amazing for attracting those bats that it relies on for pollination. Now, the fascinating thing about your Solenicarius and its related plants is that their flowers are so fantastically showy and they only emerge for one night. So traditionally, what you've found is that people who've owned these sorts of plants, imagine going back into like the Victorian era, people who owned these plants, knowing that the flower was about to bloom, would actually organise a viewing party. Everyone would gather around and watch as this enormous flower popped out and put on a display for one night only. I can only imagine how fantastic that is. And so that's your vampiress of the cactus world. Bit of a tired trope, I know, but hey, aren't all monsters? And if we're going to stick with some pretty tired tropes about how women are represented in horror literature, let's have a look at the black widow's poison. Of course, witches and all sorts of other female beasties in horror literature have used poison as a means of ensnaring, seducing, and killing their male prey. And so why not have a look at some plants that are really well suited to that purpose? This one here is Adenia kirkii. Now your Adenias, members of the Passifloraceae family related to passion fruits, are known to contain in their sap some of the most toxic compounds found in the entire plant world. Now, Adenia kirkii, this fantastic vining caudiciform plant that has the most delicate, almost variegated leaves, contains within it a compound called kirkion. And it is an incredibly potent toxin. You need to be really, really careful when handling and especially pruning a plant like this one. But this one is just a teaser for something that is even more ridiculously potent. Let's have a look at it. It's another Adenia, Small in size because this is just a seedling, but it packs a really significant punch. This is called Adenia volkensii, and some scientists, on studying the compounds in this plant, have isolated something called volkensian. And it has been postulated that volkensian is the #1 most toxic substance that can be found in any plant, anywhere. Isn't that insane? Get a bit of this stuff into your system and it will cause catastrophic heart failure. Needless to say, when I found this out, because I like to collect bizarre, strange and extreme things, I had to get my hands on one. But, as you can imagine, I am exceedingly careful when doing anything with this plant. Prefer not to touch it at all. But that's that idea of your black widow's poison encapsulated. I can't think of a better example than this, because it's about as extreme as it gets. Now, from your classic horror tropes to things that are far more recent, let's consider the living dead. This is a plant called Euphorbia platyclada, and the way that it grows, it mimics death. I suppose it's a fantastic way of preventing herbivores from coming and browsing on it. They don't want to eat a bunch of dead sticks. They want to find something fleshy, juicy, delicious. And, you know, something like this certainly doesn't whet the appetite. And so what you've got here, I suppose, is almost like the zombie of the plant world. It looks dead, but it is very much alive. The fantastic thing about this particular plant is that at some point in its past, it copped a really bad beating of sunburn. And parts of this plant that you can see here are actually dead. But I challenge you to recognize which part is which. So effective is its camouflage. What you'll find, the easiest way to tell which part is alive, a little bit later on in the growing season, it'll start to put out these tiny, very tiny euphorbia flowers. That'll signify that those parts of this plant are alive. What I'll probably do is I'll propagate it, I'll chop it up, keep the living parts and throw away all the dead bits. But, fantastic example of a plant that mimics death to stave off death. And there's a lot more examples of plants just like that you can find scattered all throughout the plant world. But let's fast forward now into another modern example of a horror monster that's also represented through some of these crazy succulent plants. Now, not all too long ago, we saw the release of Stranger Things. The primary antagonist in that show was a monster called the Demogorgon that had this quite hideous, fleshy, gaping maw that almost resembled, I don't know, some kind of hellish flower. Now, I have no doubts whatsoever the plant upon which the Demogorgon's head was based. It was the flower of this humble little thing. This is a cutting of a plant called Stapelia gigantea. Stapelias, by their nature, have these quite incredible, intricate flowers. And Stapelia gigantea, as the name suggests, has the biggest flower of them all. Now, the thing about Stapelia flowers is that they mimic carrion. They mimic death because they're not pollinated by bees, they're pollinated by flies. And so the flowers themselves, they have the colour of rotting flesh. They're thick, they're fleshy, they've got all these intricate parts, I suppose like a bit of rotting meat. And most fantastically, they smell like rotting meat too. I've got a whole greenhouse filled with stapeliads. And I know, when flowering season starts, this is going to be a real sensory joy to experience. You know, wish me luck, right? So, your Demogorgon or Stapelia gigantea, you make the decision. And all the Stapelias and all of their cousins have got really similar, revolting, fleshy, monstrous flowers that kind of have that gaping, hellish maw at their centre. For example, I draw your attention to this little Stapeliad relative. This is Huernia palanzii, and in its own way, it almost looks like this monstrous bunch of furry tentacles erupting from the soil. Hideously monstrous in its own fashion. But I want to draw your attention to this horned appendage, because this, I believe, only lends to its horrible credentials even more. This thing here is actually a seed pod. It's thick, It's fleshy, it's horned, kind of demonic in its own way. And what will happen is that when it's ready, when it's ripe, it won't just drop its seeds, of course not. That's not true for any monstrous beast. It will actually split, rip open, and burst forth the seeds within, which are all kind of feathery in a way that they can then scatter to the wind and release upon the earth more of these monstrous tentacled beasts. Fantastic. Now, the flowers of this particular plant look a little bit like these weird red demonic furry mouths as well. Not too unlike a smaller version of your Stapelia gigantea. Fantastic. But pollinating them manually is an almost impossible experience. You need a microscope in order to do it effectively. But flies and insects, they do this really, really well. And so sometime last summer, some fly went from some other random stapeliad in my collection, deposited its pollen into one of those demonic mouths, and this is the end result. So I'm going to be really fascinated to see what monstrous qualities, whatever hybrid this thing produces. Can't wait to find out. And of course, it would be neglectful of me to talk about the world of horrible monsters in succulents without just reflecting on the spiny, beastly nature of cacti. And what better example than to share with you than this one. This is just a baby. This is Carnegie gigantea, your common saguaro, you know, iconic towering beasts of the desert. Fantastic, you know, cowboy iconography and all the rest of it. But here we're reshaping an icon of the wild, wild west into something far more hideous and monstrous, because have a look at the spines on this thing. They are as big as the plant itself. And the reason that I thought it's well worth sharing with you Carnegie gigantea and its spines is because I've actually got some personal experience dealing with spines from a plant just like this one. When I first started my collection, I wasn't growing in this fantastic and very sturdy greenhouse. I had a dinky little plastic thing, and one day I went inside, and then this gust of wind just rushed through as I was leaning forward inspecting some plants over here, and as the gust hit, what should I feel but this terrible biting, searing pain square in my back. What had happened? I had a bigger Carnegie gigantea on the shelf behind me, and the wind had knocked it off. And imagine spines like that impaling themselves straight into my back. Now, me being a good plant parent, my biggest concern was for the plant rather than myself. I had to extricate it without damaging it. So, you know, I guess it's also nice sometimes to be mindful of our care of these fairly monstrous little things, but that's your spined, beastly monster for you. Fantastic. But sometimes the world of horror isn't really just about monsters. Sometimes it's about forcing us to question the nature of humanity in the grander cosmic scale, you know, in the space of Lovecraft and the Call of Cthulhu and that sort of thing. And I thought there's probably no better example of that than this particular plant here. This is a Cleistocactus plagiostoma. Now, we may have heard that saying, there are no straight lines in nature. And by and large, I reckon that's pretty true. Until you start having a look closely at a plant like this one, because these plants and others that are closely related have got tubercles, tubercles being kind of the bumpy parts on the ribs of cacti, that are almost hexagonal or octagonal in shape with very clear sort of tessellated lines. Makes for a really quite beautiful plant until you think too hard about it and you start wondering about how that sits with our traditional view of the natural world. I find it pretty creepy. Now, there are a bunch of plants, if you're interested in this sort of thing, that have a similar growth form. Probably the most prominent of which is the rare cacti Rauhocereus riosaniensis, which has even more prominent, almost diamond-shaped tubercles. But you can also find Borsicactus tessellatus, which is so named for its tessellated tubercles. Well worth a look if you want to sit there, stare at your cactus and ponder the deeper cosmic mysteries of the universe. But there is one cactus that is more monstrous and more terrifying than anything I've talked about so far today. And paradoxically, it's a plant that's grown and loved for its cutesy appearance. I am of course talking about Opuntia macrodasys, the bunny ears cactus. Those cutesy little things that look like darling little creatures. And yet, they have a terrifying secret lurking, something that I'm sure anyone who owns them knows all about. Those delightful little polka dots that are scattered all over the pads of the plant, adding to its very cutesy appearance, actually hold a very dark and painful secret, because those little polka dots are made up of what are called glochids, and glochids are modified spines. Now your typical cactus spine, which is bold and showy and it'll stab you if you get too close to it, they don't go out of their way though, unless I guess you're standing in a greenhouse that gets blown over by the wind. But your glochid on your bunny ears cactus has a habit where if you just accidentally brush past it, or maybe a tiny gust of wind breezes past the plant, these glochids will detach themselves, and they're like tiny shards of fiberglass, tiny little hairs that get lodged into your skin and cause immense pain and immense suffering. And they're really hard to get out once they're in. Why you'd subject yourself to that sort of misery, that sort of torture, all for the sake of a very cute little plant, I don't know. And I reckon there's been more than a fair share of bunny ears cacti that have been bought because they're so cute and ended up in the bin because they're so miserably painful. I reckon you'd agree that they are by far the most terrifying plant that we've seen in today's episode. Now, that's it for today. I hope you've really enjoyed this spooky exploration of the horrifying world of cacti and succulents. I'm Michael, and I will be back next Monday for another episode of Arid Zone.